Did I say your name right, Katie? Is it
Mattaini?
Mattaini. I
like
keep
tiny, tiny, like small.
Mattaini. Okay.
It's not obvious.
All right, welcome everyone. Let's see. Okay, you want to go ahead and do your little cut and paste link about the chat, or do you want me to?
I can do it. I'm trying to get all my screen sharing things set up so I can do that part. I've been copying and pasting. The two things that I've been doing have been for this changing the chat, but also the link to our Slack community. So there they are. Okay, let's see, where are we at? Maybe I'll give people another 10 seconds or so to join us before we get started.
Kate, do you mind also putting the link to the slides in the chat?
Oh, yes. Yes. So all of Katie's resources were made available ahead of time. And they're all on the Mastery Grading schedule page. So if you scroll down to this session, you'll find the links there. And I'll be posting them back to the chat as we go. The slides that we're looking at right now are available there as well. So if you want to click through the links using that version, please totally feel free.
If anyone sees me labeled as Owen, please remind me to rename myself, because I'm operating on his account today because that's where all the controls are. So I have to keep remembering to rename myself. So it looks like we're up to about 70 attendees. So very cool.
Okay. We have about 2 minutes before we'll get started. For those of you guys that are just joining us as I've been posting to the chat, don't forget to change your chat to all panelists and attendees. If you have questions for our presenter, you're welcome to use the Q&A feature. So we'll have some moderated Q&A at the end. The slides and other links that are here are available on the conference schedule page. So if you want to go and open your own copy of them, please feel free to do that. And I'll be posting those to the chat as we go. So it looks like we're up to 83 participants for this session. That's great. If you're thinking about the other session, both of these concurrent sessions will be recorded and uploaded to our webpage probably over the next week or two. It takes us a little bit of time. So if you haven't seen the Build a Syllabus workshop talk before their presentation, it's really great. But it's great that you're here. You can watch either of these recordings in about a week or so once we get those videos up. We built a new channel in our Slack community that's the channel is called Inclusive. And so I've posted some of our links there. And if you're interested in these ideas or keeping this conversation going beyond this presentation this morning, please come and join us in that Slack, in that new Slack channel. We just built it this morning, so it's brand new, needs some attention. If you haven't joined Slack yet, I just posted the join link to the chat. Awesome. Okay, well, it looks like it's 10:45 right on the dot, so we will get started. Like I mentioned, the slides that we're looking at here are available. I'll post a link to the chat. They're also, all of the resources will be available on our conference schedule webpage. Okay, so where we are. So our goal for today is to start building stuff. So this is the progressing cohort on inclusive pedagogy. The novice cohort is doing the Build a Syllabus workshop presentation, which is really great. It'll be recorded if you want to go check that out later. And once we're done here, we'll have a little bit of a lunch break before we come back later to let you know what's coming up. As you guys know, we are recording this session. So any of your comments to the chat or to the Q&A will be recorded. We'll upload all of the video recordings from the conference sometime over the next couple of weeks. It takes us a little bit of time to process all of the files and get our links working, but you can check them out there. A big shout out and thank you to the College Bridge. They've been our sponsor this year, so they're providing us support in a lot of different directions. They were our sponsor last year, and we really appreciate their continued interest in all of these topics. Okay, so here we go. So today's speaker on inclusive pedagogy is Dr. Katie Mattaini. Katie is a lecturer in biology at Roger Williams University in Bristol, Rhode Island. She's taught both using mastery grading and also ungrading in her different classes. She typically teaches some of the introductory biology lectures, but also some upper division biology classes. She implemented all of these mastery grading, ungrading things back in the 2020, 2021 school year. So she definitely jumped right in with all of those ideas. Before I hand it over to Katie, I'm going to post the slides and resources to the chat window. These resources are available on our conference webpage. So if you go to the schedule page, you should be able to find them there. Okay, that being said, I will, I guess I would say hand the mic over, but I guess I'm going to hand the screen share over to Katie to get us started with this great session.
Awesome. Thank you, Kate. Okay. Okay, so first thing I want to say, since we're talking about inclusive pedagogy today, I think it's important to acknowledge that I come from a place of a lot of privilege, right? So I just want to put that out there kind of before we get into this discussion. The other thing that I think it's important to say is, we're talking about inclusive pedagogy here, and none of us are ever going to be at a point when we can wash our hands and say, okay, I'm now inclusive, I'm done. I have reached this point. This is a journey, right? We're all at different places on this journey. And so I think that everyone is welcome, regardless of kind of where you are on that journey. Okay. The other thing that I want to mention, I was really glad that we clarified about standards-based grading versus specs grading. I have used standards-based grading, and I'm going to mainly talk about things from that angle, but I think all of the things that we're talking about could be applied to either one. Okay, so first thing I wanted to take on for a minute here is something that we've been talking about kind of on and off at different places throughout the conference. This is the Mastery Grading Conference, so I think we have to take a minute and kind of sit with that name and kind of what that can mean. So of course, being a scientist, I immediately want to know what the definitions of things are. And so if you just Google dictionary mastery, right? I think most of us, when we're talking about mastery grading, are thinking about this first definition, comprehensive knowledge or skill in a subject. But obviously that's not the only definition of the word mastery, right? And the second definition, I think, is where the more harmful connotations of this come in, control or superiority over someone or something, right? And obviously the someone is the more harmful thing here. As we've been having these discussions, I have definitely heard people, talking about is this a real problem that people have? Is it a perceived problem? And so I wanted to just tell kind of a quick story from a colleague of mine. So this person is not at my institution, she's at another institution, and they have a HHMI grant for promoting inclusion in all of their STEM program. And they have a program where professors can apply for a course release to do a project to make their class more inclusive. And so she was telling me this story about how they got a couple of applications for people who wanted to apply mastery grading to their courses. And the people reading these applications were both other professors and other students of various identities. And she was like, this was really interesting because they all thought this pedagogy was really great and really interesting. And yet these applications were not really getting that much support. And she told me she felt like they had to have a really uncomfortable, so the woman who I'm talking about is white, right? And she said, this really showed my own privilege to me because they had to sit down and have this uncomfortable conversation with me. And I'll use some of her exact words that she told me. She said she realized that my students and colleagues of color were reading these applications, and I was reading it as, mastery in this first definition, but they were being repeatedly and unnecessarily assaulted by a word with such strong and obvious connections to slavery. So I think, again, some people are asking, like, is this a real problem? And so I'm just giving this kind of little anecdote as an instance where, like, someone I know has said, yes, like, this is affecting my colleagues in a negative way. And the other thing that I wanted to bring up here, which is a common kind of thing that we grapple with when we talk about inclusive pedagogy or inclusion in general, is this idea of impact versus intent, right? So maybe when I call something mastery grading, my intent is not to remind people about slavery, right? But that is maybe the impact that I'm having as some people hear it based on, their identities or based on their experiences. And I really like, there's an analogy or a metaphor that Ijeoma Oluo uses in her book, So You Want to Talk About Race, when she's talking about impact versus intent. And she talks about how, someone could be walking down the street and maybe like a second person is kind of flailing their arms around and like hits them, right? And the person who hits them is supposed to apologize, right? They're not going to be like, well, I didn't mean to hit you, so you should just deal with it, right? That we can have impacts that we are not thinking about if we don't kind of interrogate what we're doing and kind of reflect on what we're doing ahead of time. So I am definitely in the camp of let's try to move away from the mastery grading name. And I think there'll be probably some discussion later on about kind of what some of the alternatives are. But I just felt like had to address that before kind of moving on in this talk about inclusion. Okay, so the other kind of context that I want to give for this workshop is when I'm talking about standards-based grading or the group of pedagogies that we call mastery grading and inclusive pedagogy, today I want us to kind of focus on the space where those overlap, but those are not entirely overlapping things, right? You could implement specs or standards-based grading in a way that is not inclusive, right? This is not some type of Band-Aid that you can stick on over top and say, oh, look, now I'm perfectly inclusive because I have adopted this system. And then the other thing, which is quite obvious, hopefully, is that there are a lot of aspects of running an inclusive course or, creating an inclusive academic environment that are not related to standards-based grading. And so I'm happy to talk about those as well. And I put together some resources, like very brief list of resources that you could start looking into if you wanted to about inclusive pedagogy outside of assessment. But mostly in this workshop, I want to focus on the overlap of these things. Okay, so when I am running any of my courses, I like to start out by talking to my students about my core beliefs about teaching and learning. And I think that these are, the type of things that I used to list like in my teaching philosophy for like applying to jobs or, doing my like renewing my contracts and things like that. And I started to feel like these are things that my students should know about how I approach teaching as one kind of first step to trying to make an environment where everyone feels included and where everyone feels safe. And so I just want to kind of tell you the things that I tell my students. This is where I'm coming from. Okay. So I think some of you have heard me say this extensively before, maybe on Twitter. The first one that I share with them, right? Teaching and learning happens in the context of relationships. It's not transactional, right? So right up front, I'm like, I care about you as a human. I want to engage with you as a human. This is how I want the class to be. That's that. Okay. And then I bring up equity. I think that this, like, my kind of philosophy is the students should be able to see under the hood, right? I don't want to hide from them that I'm trying to make it equitable. So I talk to them about how I have thought about equity in building this whole class, right? Again, I'm not just trying to put on Band-Aids over top of things that I've done before and saying, okay, now this is automatically equitable somehow. Okay, so for me, I teach biology. So I like to talk to them about something that's inherent when we talk about standards-based or mastery grading practices. We believe that, we believe in this growth mindset, right? That everybody can learn our subject. And I use some growth mindset terms, right? If they put in the work, use effective techniques, and get help when that's not enough. I teach a lot of intro bio, so I try to also kind of insert in there how students should, try to approach the learning process, or some kind of ways that they could be successful in the learning process. I think those three are probably the most relevant for kind of the equity piece. But I also talk about how students are humans with complicated lives, right? Again, saying, I'm going to relate to you as a human. And so I try to make my policies flexible to account for those things. And then the last one is more about the fact that I'm going to use active learning in my class. And that if I tell them specifically, like, if you ever feel like something I'm giving you is busy work, just ask me, like, why are we doing this? And I'll explain it to you. Or if it really is just busy work, then we can get rid of it. So this is where I'm coming from. Like I said, I bring this up because I think it can really help create an inclusive environment if you talk about these things from the beginning. Obviously, that's not enough to just say it once and not do anything with these things. But these are all of the reasons that I make the decisions that I do about my syllabus and how the course is going to be set up. So I put these up on the first day before we talk about, like, what is this class going to be like? How is your grade going to be calculated? Because these are the reasons I've made the decisions that I have. The other reason I bring this up in this workshop today is this idea that, again, we're approaching teaching and learning as humans, right? And as humans, we have various identities that are going to impact the teaching and learning process. We're not these kind of solely logical brains that are approaching this learning process. And so I think that is inherent to my thoughts about how we approach inclusive pedagogy is, what are the identities that we hold, and what are the identities that our students hold, and how does that impact what's happening in our classes? Okay, so I'm going to have us do a little activity here. So this is going to involve, writing a list of things. So whatever form you want to take your notes in, whether you need to grab a pencil and paper, whether you're going to take it on your computer, whatever, maybe just take a moment to get those supplies. This activity about our embodied selves is from the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria by Beverly Daniel Tatum. Okay, so hopefully we've all gathered our supplies. So this is an activity about who we are, who our identities, what identities we hold. And because I want to talk about mainly how these identities impact students, I'd like you to think about your own perspective when you were a student, right? So currently some of my identities are like, I'm a mom and I'm a spouse. That was not the case when I was a student. So I wouldn't, include those things in this list that I'm making. But if you mess it up, it's not a big deal, don't worry. So we're going to be thinking about who we were as students. Or if you are a student, you can think about who you are right now. Okay. So in this exercise, we're just going to complete the sentence, I am blank, with whatever descriptors you want to use, and write down as many descriptors as you can think of in the next 60 seconds. So go ahead and take 60 seconds to do that. All right, that's our 60 seconds. So what I'd like you to do next is in your list, take a second and pick like the top 2 or 3 descriptors that you think made you feel most comfortable or gave you an advantage in class when you were a student. And then kind of also do the flip. If you have descriptors that you feel made you less comfortable in class or put you at a disadvantage, choose the top 2 or 3 of those as well. So take a minute to do that. Okay, so hopefully this should work now. So Kate, do you mind repasting this link into the chat? That would be great. So I just want to have us share, this will be anonymous, right? What descriptors, those first 2 or 3 you chose, have made you feel the most comfortable or given you an advantage in class as a student? And if this works, which hopefully it should, this should make a little word cloud for us. I love seeing all the different descriptors people use of themselves. I mean, there are like a couple obvious large ones here, which is one of the things that I like about the word cloud, but we used a lot of different descriptors. Right, and these are supposed to be our top 2 or 3. So white, you know, that's a obvious big one in the US in general. And there are a lot of ones that I see that are, you know, math, biology, physics, like already identifying ourselves even as students, like in being good in those subjects, which kind of gets at this whole growth mindset thing, I think. You know, I think a lot of us have experienced students who have either math or science like trauma, right? And not having that math or science trauma is a huge advantage. I see I'm privileged, I'm middle class, I'm cishet. These are some of the kind of the identities that we're going to be talking about in a couple minutes. But there are a lot more kind of, you know, descriptions of our personalities than I expected. I like that. Food/housing, that's a good one. Okay. So I want to take a minute also and do the same thing. Why are you not working? Okay. So kind of the opposite one. What descriptors, if you have any, have made you feel the least comfortable or put you at a disadvantage as a student? Hungover is what I just saw. This is interesting because I feel like now here I see a lot more things that are kind of traditional, like identity categories, right? There's woman, female, brown, gay, first gen, kind of things are moving too fast and we don't see them. But I think a lot fewer kind of things about our personalities and a lot more things about kind of our identity categories. See working class, immigrants, someone brought up neurodiversity, which I'm happy that they did. Broke. Mm. All right, thank you. All right, thanks for sharing those. I wanted to let us kind of talk about those in a way that, you know, people could speak anonymously if they wanted to. Okay. So a couple things I just wanted to bring up. Again, I took this activity from Beverly Daniel Tatum's book, and she talks about using it in her classes, you know, not in the context of being in an inclusion like seminar, right? So she just asked the students, fill this out, list as many things as you can in 60 seconds. So one of the things she brings up is that in that context where you're not like already being prompted to think about inclusion, students will rarely respond with an identity if they're talking about like a majority or advantaged identity, right? So you would rarely see a white person say like, I'm white, whereas frequently you see other people say like, I'm Asian, I'm Black, right? That is something that they identify, whereas, you know, if we are in the majority or advantaged identity, often, you know, that's not something that we have to think about. And so we don't necessarily write that unless we have kind of delved into that. She also brings up that, you know, what identities are the most important to us is something that changes over time, right? It's not necessarily a static thing. So, you know, what I felt was important as a student is not necessarily the same thing that I feel is important as a professor, right? So just things to keep in mind. So as we go forward and think about kind of how to be inclusive in our use of these different techniques, you know, just keep these identities that we just saw in mind. So when we're going through and thinking about kind of how we can build a mastery grading system that is inclusive, you know, we want to think about in education, like who is the education system built for and who is either excluded or harmed or both by this system. And so I think all of these things came up in our word clouds, but just some things to keep in mind. You know, some of these are more obvious than others. Keep in mind race, ethnicity, nation of origin, first language, gender and sexual orientation, physical or mental ability, including, we have a lot of students now more than ever before who suffer from anxiety. And at least at my school, I'm seeing more and more students who are neurodivergent in some way or another, socioeconomic status, religion, age, and I'm sure there are others that I'm not listing here as well. But these are all things that are going to affect how our students exist in the classroom and how they relate to us. So before we kind of jump into thinking about how we're going to be inclusive, I wanted to bring up, I bring this up, I think, in every talk that I do now, either about standards grading or inclusion. I love the book by Joe Feldman, Grading for Equity. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. And he talks about 3 pillars of equitable grading. So he says equitable grading should reflect student learning. I think that's one of the major advantages of these systems that we've been talking about all day yesterday. They more validly convey a student's academic performance, I think, than a lot of traditional methods. But we also need to have systems that are bias resistant, right? So if you're in an inclusion seminar, hopefully you are trying to think about these things, but we all have these kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Now I'm going to blank on it. Biases that we are not consciously thinking about, right? Unconscious biases. And so we have to actually do something to try to combat those unconscious biases, right? And not just be like, oh, I'm going to try to not grade Black students differently, or I'm going to try to not grade my autistic students differently, things like that. So I think that's one of the places where just using standards-based or specs grading is not necessarily going to address that component of equitable grading. And then lastly, we want grading that's motivational, which again, I think this is one of the places that using specs or standards grading is strong. But we also have to be really intentional about, I think, how we talk and communicate with our students, around, you have not yet met this objective, or, that kind of growth mindset in our communication. And another kind of place that we can stumble sometimes is in some of these cognitive frames that we use when we approach thinking about some of these problems. So I've heard a couple people bring this up kind of at different points over the last couple days, is this idea of a deficit model or a deficit frame. So I teach intro bio, and so there are a lot of discussions in my department about how you deal with students who are, quote, unprepared or underprepared. And a lot of times there are comments like, well, yes, we have this inequity in grades. We see that we have higher DFW rates among certain groups of students, but, based on the fact that there's systemic racism and that certain students who live in certain areas, their school systems are not as high quality. So it's unsurprising that they have lower grades. And well, in some cases that may be true, that blames students, it blames their circumstances. It's kind of a way to wash our hands and absolve ourselves of any type of participation in that system, right? And so I think that is not a good place to stop, right? That is essentially, it's just not a good place to stop. So I would encourage you to try to think, as we're going through this activity that we're going to do next, from an equity frame of mind, right? Focusing on, like, yes, there is our systemic problems, but what can we do about those systemic problems? So saying, like, taking some of that responsibility. What can I as an instructor do, or an administrator, or, whatever your role is, to remove these systemic barriers to student success, either within the system or by working to kind of break down the system. And I just want to note that these are from Ben Simone. So I definitely also encourage you to read her work if you're interested in these different frames and mindsets. Okay, so I want us to, at this point, kind of take some time to reflect, like, on our own practices. So this is the progressing track. So I've set up this Google Doc to it kind of assumes that you've done this before, but if you haven't, this doc is set up with the same kind of categories, I think, as what they're going over in the Build a Syllabus workshop today. So I think it should work regardless of whether you have done this before or not. So this link, Kate, can you paste it into the chat if you haven't already? This link will bring you to a Google Doc. It is set so that you can't edit it. So if you want to either make a copy of it or download it, you can do either of those things from the file menu. And so this is just going to take some time. I've built in 10 minutes here for us to kind of reflect, look through this table, and just think about kind of what do I do now and who might this harm? Or if you haven't done it yet, how do I want to do this? And can I prevent that from doing harm? So we're going to take 10 minutes and do this, and then we're going to go into some breakout rooms to discuss.
I'm sorry, Katie, just FYI, breakout rooms are not available in this format. So
Okay, so we're not going to do that.
sorry about that.
All right, I will plan in these 10 minutes.
In the meantime, if all of our participants work on their worksheet for 10 minutes, we'll brainstorm some tech solutions here in the back.
Sounds good. All right, we hit the 10-minute mark, but I don't think we're really short on time. Do people, well, I don't know. Yeah, we can go ahead and go to the next thing. Okay, so it's fine if you're still working on, filling things out. So while everyone was working, we were talking about how we were going to handle the fact that I didn't realize we didn't have breakout rooms. So that's fine. Thankfully, we have other options.
No, I'll take this moment. I will apologize. That was totally my job, was to figure that out for you. So I apologize to you, Katie. We'll make it work.
It's fine. We're all instructors. This happens to us all the time, right? You have to be able to adapt on the fly. No worries. Okay, so pretend this slide is a little bit different than it is. So what we were going to do is go into breakout rooms and do this, but we can also do it in a different way. So I set up a Padlet, which is basically just a place that we can all share some of these ideas. And the nice thing about it is it will exist in the future, right? So we can always go back and look at it later. So again, Kate, if you don't mind dropping that Padlet link into the chat. So I'm gonna go out of this. I might need to reshare my whole screen. I just want to show people quickly how this works. Okay. So you can all see my Padlet right now, is that correct? Okay, cool. So this is what I've set up just as a way for us to share out in a session where we have a ton of people. And so this is set up in columns that correspond to what's going on in that Google Doc, right, that you've been looking at. So the first column is what learning objectives do I measure, and then what assessment tools do I use. Hopefully this should be fairly straightforward for people to add to. You just click on the little thing that says plus. You don't even need to give it a title. You could just write something like, here's an example. And then as soon as you click off it, it will make a post. So please don't share every single, or don't feel like you have to share every single thing you put on, but maybe pick like one or two of the things that you're most excited about changing and add those. And then we can start kind of having a discussion. So let's take a couple minutes here. Like I said, add one or two. Sorry, I probably wasn't very clear about this. What you're supposed to be adding here is kind of any changes that you want to make. So how might you do things in a more inclusive way, not just necessarily what you're doing right now. So what are some inclusive ways to change what learning objectives you measure if you need to? What are some inclusive ways or inclusive assessment tools that you could use?
Katie, while everyone's working, I have a question. I'm not that familiar with Padlet, but someone asked in the Q&A if it's possible for us to save everyone's responses here for later. Would that be possible for us to share?
Yeah, so this is going to exist
our final version
indefinitely.
Okay, and will it use the same link later?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Well,
yeah, that's one
both
of the
worksheet links and the Padlet links are on Slack under that inclusive channel that we built this morning. And they're also on our mastery rating on the schedule page. So you can find them there, and I'll make sure that I repost them to the Slack community. So anyone that wants to view this later file it away for use later, you'll be able to find it.
Yeah, I really like Padlet for this kind of thing. I also love Jamboard. I think that it's hard with too many people on Jamboard. Padlet also has a really nice timeline tool, which I've used like when we did history of cancer biology. I had the students make a timeline like in real time like this. That was a lot of fun. Okay, so since, we're not doing the breakout rooms thing, and I feel like it's wrong for me to be the only person who speaks in an inclusive pedagogy like workshop. I think what we want to do is kind of let people unmute, like raise your hand using the Zoom feature, and we can call on people to be unmuted to talk about some of these things. So I don't think we necessarily have to go column by column. Maybe just if you had, a revelation about something that you want to change or a question that you want to ask about how to do some of these things more inclusively, go ahead and on your Zoom options, use the raise hand feature, and we can, Sharona can unmute you.
We have a hand from Andrew Cooper. Go ahead, Andrew.
Yeah, so one of the things that I'm very flexible with is deadlines, but I typically rely on the student to sort of send me an email or initiate the process of like, oh no, right? And it occurs to me that many students, and this is definitely not equitably distributed, aren't comfortable with that, or they're not aware that like, the typical, white dude is like, yeah, I'll ask for more time, because why not, right? But that comes from a place of privilege. So I guess my question is, I'm thinking about is how to make that more transparent than I am flexible, without incentivizing people to put off work, and then, screwing themselves over, which is something that, again, probably the white guys are going to fall into. Yeah, that's my question, right?
Yeah, I mean, and obviously I'm not the expert on these things, but I can share like a couple of approaches that I've seen people use. So one possibility is just not to give penalties for late work, right? Which I don't think necessarily incentivizes them to be late, but just doesn't penalize. I've also seen, and I wish I could give proper attribution for this, but it was I saw someone say something on Twitter, and I have no idea who it was. But they basically had and distributed in their syllabus and on their LMS like a Google form, right? That was just like, if your work is going to be late, fill out this Google form, period, right? And it's a little bit tough because, like you said, you don't necessarily want to incentivize people to be late. And so there's kind of this balance. And with a lot of, I feel like with a lot of these decisions on inclusive pedagogy, there's a balance, right? It's some people are going to take advantage of whatever system you set up, right? And so what I am always trying to balance is how much do I care about the few students who will take advantage of the system versus, trying to prevent harm to the students who need that help.
Right. I mean, I'm actually less concerned about taking advantage of, right? Because, like you say, there's not that many and whatever. I'm more concerned about, sending the message about how you should structure your time, because that's one of the things that we need to teach also, especially for people with like, certain learning disabilities, et cetera, right? That communication needs to be there. So, I don't care about taking advantage. Like the people who are going to take advantage are going to take advantage. The people who are going to cheat are going to cheat, like whatever, right?
Yeah, so I guess that idea of like potentially having like, how do you tell them to structure things? I mean, so someone I know uses this idea of like best by dates rather than due dates, right? And talks and like that language, right? She talks about it on her first day and says, it's best by this date because if you do it by this date, it's going to benefit you the most. If you do your homework by this time, it's going to prepare you well for the test. If you finish the reading before class, you're going to actually be able to participate in the class discussion. But I think a lot of that is just like constant reinforcement. But if other folks have ideas for that, I'm sure people are putting it in the chat, but definitely put it in the chat as well. I can't present and watch the chat at the same time because I get too distracted.
Thank you.
Do we have anyone else? We have a hand from Jillian Downey. Go ahead, Jillian.
So one thing I'm really struggling with is a final exam. I like the idea of a final exam as kind of a culminating experience to see how all the pieces fit together. And I feel that I've made kind of my cutoffs reasonable, but it was clear in this last, but they don't have time to redo it. And so my only way I could think about it was giving my final exam earlier and then allowing for redos, because I think that lack of redos is really difficult for them. And it is a take-home exam, right? So I don't know if you have any ideas about how to still keep the idea of a final exam, but make it be more inclusive.
Yeah, so I can, and I think Kate said this at the beginning, but I just want to re-emphasize that, I have done this, done standards-based grading once in fall of 2021 or fall of 2020. And so, I can tell you kind of my thoughts about that, but again, other people who have more experience than I do should also chime in. So when I did this, I was instituting this during a pandemic. And so I was trying to keep it as simple as possible, right? So far when I've done it, my final exam has just been retry the standards that you still need rather than let's have a cumulative exam on everything. I know based on what I've seen people present last year at this conference that some people will use it more as, if you meet X number of standards on the final exam, your grade is plus, right? So if you have enough standards to get a B, right, and you get this on the final exam, then you'll get a B+ instead, or a B- if you do really poorly on the final. And I think that it is in some ways nice to have a final because, like you said, you want them to make those connections. Other things you could think about is other ways to make those connections besides an exam. So one thing that I intended to incorporate, and that is actually in my syllabus, is this idea of concept mapping. And then I kind of did away with that because it was just too many things during the pandemic, but I want to bring it back. So I love concept mapping for having them connect these different ideas. And, maybe that depends on what your area is, right? For me, it's biology. So maybe I want them to understand how does protein structure relate to genetics or something like that. And I wanted to have them do this final project where they made a concept map that connected the different topics that we talked about in the course, right? So maybe something like that is, more equitable and could go through revision, right? You could even use peer revision for the concept maps. So you could think about something other than an exam potentially. Again, just some ideas.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a hand from Andy Bixler. Go ahead, Andy.
Hi, I used the biology syllabi in the mastering course. I can't remember what it's called, the reservoir of syllabi.
Yeah.
It was extremely helpful to me this first time setting up my course. One of the ideas that I took was that if students want to redo a quiz for a better grade, they have to meet with me first. Mm-hmm. And I got so much more student interaction that way. I really loved that aspect of it, but I also recognize that, especially when we go back to more face-to-face office hours, that's so intimidating for some students that I'm afraid, and also time consuming, if they're also working a job or whatever, I'm afraid that students will, certain groups of students particularly, will choose not to redo a quiz because of the requirement to meet with me about it first. Do you have ideas on that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's a really great point. So a couple of things. I agree that students do find or many students can find coming to office hours very intimidating. And that was never something I realized until the past couple of years. And so a couple of things I've heard people do is either have your office hours like in a common space that's not your office, right? Taking away some of that power dynamic. Either if you can reserve like a classroom, or I've tried it once before in like our coffee shop, and I've come to the conclusion that that may not be the best for some students. Like if they have ADHD, they're just like, what, there's too many things like going on. But so potentially having office hours somewhere else other than your office. Also, although obviously that's like a, you know, kind of extra, maybe an extra burden for us. The other thing that I did even before the pandemic is, you know, I offer like 3 or 4 office hours a week because I have a pretty large number of classes that I teach. And I would offer one of those on Zoom in the evenings, like even well, it wasn't Zoom, it was something else, but, you know, online pre-pandemic. So that may be another option, is to continue to offer some office hours online. Another thing I do is when I have students who need to kind of meet some hurdle, right, to come and retest or revise or whatever, you can have some hurdle that's not office hours, right? It could be for our campus, we have free peer tutoring, and I get a report for if they went to the peer tutoring or not. So I allow them to go to peer tutoring to earn a retest. And some of them are less intimidated by going to see their peers. And just by the nature of the fact that we have a whole tutoring center, there are more times available for them to do that. I also know some people will do something like just fill out a Google form that says, I did problems X, Y, and Z from the book, right? That would be a really kind of, you know, they could do that anytime they want. So those are some other options for kind of earning retesting. And kind of while we're on the topic of office hours, one of the things that I just wanted to bring up was, I know, how do I want to say this? The other thing I wanted to bring up was kind of when we offer retesting or how we offer retesting. And I have heard some people, you know, only offering retesting in office hours, which I think kind of brings up the same issues that you're bringing up, is that, you know, that may harm students who work a lot of hours or who have a chronic illness, right? Or just, again, are intimidated by coming to office hours. And so I think however we do our retesting or revision, it's important to offer that in a way that is as accessible as possible, whether that's, you know, asynchronously or, you know, during class, just in a way that is equally accessible, ideally.
Okay, so Katie, bouncing off that, we have 2 questions in the Q&A that are kind of tied together. And actually one of them is from Andy. Could you define the difference between reassessment and revision? And then secondly, from Jenny Sheldon, are reassessments kind of a disadvantage for particularly non-traditional students who have to work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so my perspective on retest or reassessment versus revision, like to me, revision says you already have a piece of work that you're going to update. So if you were writing a paper, right, you could revise that. When I give my assessments, right, it's like a page of an exam or a quiz or something. And so when they get to reassess, I give them new questions on the same material so that it's not just a question of, oh, well, I already chose option A, so this time I'm going to try option B, right? They actually have to demonstrate that they have learned something. So that is my perspective on retest or reassess versus revise. And I think that really depends on what type of assessment you're using in the first place. And then, sorry, what was the other question?
The second question is, are reassessments actually a disadvantage?
Oh, right. Okay.
Students?
Yeah, so I think my perspective on this is that learning takes a certain amount of time and effort, right? And I have not yet figured out a way to try to help people do that, you know, more efficiently. And, you know, maybe a, you know, mastery or specs or standards-based class is, you know, you do have to take more time to reassess. But I don't necessarily think that's worse than just having partial credit to begin with, right? We're giving an opportunity to get a better grade, right? We're giving an opportunity to learn material that they didn't learn the first time around. And whether or not a student takes advantage of that, or whether or not a student can access that, I guess my personal feeling is that like I can't make it so that they have to work less hours to learn the material. So I agree that that's a problem, but I think that that's a problem regardless of what type of assessment we're using, right? Like I cannot make biology easier or faster for someone to learn. That's my personal feeling.
Okay, we've got some more great questions, but I know that your slides have some really great examples of your inclusive practices. Do you want to go back to those? Or
sure. Yeah, I mean, I can just like go over a couple of those. I threw those up there because I didn't want to be like, yeah, okay, I'll go over a couple of examples.
No. Listen. This is totally you. So we are happy to support you in whatever choice you want to make, okay? But I thought that some of those examples might really help this discussion,
Okay.
and then we could circle back to questions at the end. But this discussion is really great too. So let us know.
Always the problem.
How you want to use the time.
Okay. So as Kate said, I just put a couple of examples in here of things that I've tried to think about for my own class to make it as inclusive as possible. All of these really depend on your situation. And these are by no means like the only options. So something I wanted to bring up is that, you know, what learning objectives do I measure? This is a big question. And something that we talk about within, you know, the specs or the standards-based world is, you know, do we measure some type of participation or not, right? And maybe if you're like really hardcore pure standards or pure specs, like you don't measure participation at all. I find that with my intro bio students, they need some guidance, like someone said before, in how to structure their time and what types of activities they should be doing to actually learn the material. And so I do give them some credit for that, but I try to do it in a way where I'm not making a qualitative judgment on, you know, has someone done enough to count as participation, right? Because when you're making a qualitative judgment like that, that's a time when those unconscious biases really affect things. So this is how I've structured my kind of participation grade, right? I have it as one of my objectives. I call it the learning community objective. Again, trying to emphasize that this is something you do because, you know, we are a community of learners. And so they have to earn a certain number of learning community credits. But I try to do this in a way where they can earn learning community credits in so many different ways that hopefully it's accessible to everybody. I don't want to just make it, did you come to class today? Because obviously that can affect students, again, who have chronic illness, who work jobs with unpredictable hours, who are parents, or just people, you know, whose roommate had a mental crisis that they needed to help with. You know, it affects all sorts of people. So I allow options like, you know, obviously, yes, doing the activities in class is one of those. Doing the homework is one of those. But they can also earn credits for going to tutoring. They can earn credits for coming to review sessions. They can earn credits for going to our department seminar. Or we built recently this past year these structured study groups that go over case studies that are related to what we're doing in class that week. And so they can go to those. It's called BioX is the program. Going to BioX gets them a credit. So if they have to miss class one day, you know, there's like so many different ways they can quote, like make it up or get those credits. They can come to office hours, that's a credit. So I've tried to structure it in a way that A, I'm not making a qualitative judgment on who has participated enough, and B, that there are lots of options to fulfill that objective. I think this probably is pretty widely recognized at this point, that having exclusively like timed high stakes exams can be really harmful to certain students, like ESL students, the many students that we have with high test anxiety, right? And there's so many options beyond that, or in addition to that, right? Either having other types of assessments like projects, presentations, take-home exams, which I know is kind of a touchy subject right now because people are concerned about academic integrity. I will say again, because I started doing this during the pandemic and everything was online, I did all my exams take home online this past year. And there were a lot fewer instances of academic dishonesty with this system than in spring 2020 when I did online exams with a traditional graded system. So I will say that. How grading is performed. One thing you might want to think about is grading work that's anonymized, again, to try to combat any of those, unconscious biases. I know my LMS offers this as an option, and my LMS tends to be, I use Sakai, and so it tends to be one of the ones with fewer features. So my guess is that many other LMSs have this feature as well, the option of grading anonymously. So that's one option. I already talked about this, performing reassessment in a way that's accessible to different students. And then one thing that I learned from doing it this first time is that I think my approach was I posted students' kind of grades in a quote grade book. Again, my LMS didn't let me do this, but I had a system for communicating what standards they had met. And I was like, okay, well, I'm posting that you met, 8 out of 10 standards. It's clear what your grade is, but apparently that's difficult for students to figure out. And so I think it can be difficult for anyone who hasn't used a system like this before, and especially for first-gen students who may not have as much experience like interpreting syllabi. And so one thing I'm going to do in the future is try to build in grade check-ins. So I have them do weekly homework quizzes, and I think one of the kind of final questions I'm going to have on their weekly homework quiz is like, what is your grade based on what you see in gradebook? And a bunch of people who are on this panel actually helped me figure that out. So thank you to all of you guys. And I think, again, these are just a couple examples. So I think those are some of the examples I had. And before we go back to taking any more questions, I just want to reiterate that there is obviously there are a ton of decisions you have to make in your class beyond just how you assess, right? And so all of those decisions also can be inclusive or not inclusive, can be harmful or not harmful, right? And so I just put together like a very, very brief couple of resources in case this is something you're more interested in, that you can dive into some of those. The link is here on the slides, it's in Slack, it's on the website for the conference schedule. So feel free to check those out if you want. And that's, I think, all the stuff that I had planned. So if we want, we can go back to kind of questions and talking about people's other thoughts for how to do standards-based or anything about their class inclusively.
Yeah, great, Katie. Thank you so much. I've learned so much from everything that's been said, and your presentation was fantastic. Just a reminder that any of the attendees, you guys are welcome to use the Q&A feature to ask Katie any kinds of questions, and we'll spend the next few minutes getting through as many of those as we can before we wrap it up. All right, so one of the questions that we got from our attendees said, do you do the reassessment at the end of the semester or after each exam? How often do you schedule these? Are they scheduled by students? Can you talk to us about that?
Yeah, so again, I can tell you what I personally do, and there are as many ways to do this as there are people in this session probably. So again, first time I've done this during a pandemic, switching my entire grading system. So I did stick with doing exams only, although again, they were take home, 24 hours to do it. And so I had 40 objectives, which I know is probably a lot for a lot of people here. And we had 4 midterm exams, so about 10 objectives per exam, kind of distributed throughout the semester. And so after the first exam, I would allow students to retest up to 2 objectives per week, right? Just to keep it to a reasonable amount for myself to grade. And I just had a Google form where they would request which learning objectives they wanted to retest. And I also had one of those hurdles. If they earned the lowest assessment, which was you just wrote nonsense, then they had to either come see me or go to tutoring before that. And so I would say if you needed to reach that hurdle, remind me what day did you come to office hours, or what day did you go to the tutoring center? So that was ongoing. So basically from the time that the first exam happened, I had people retesting every week unless there was already an exam scheduled. So I had, again, things were weird because of COVID. We were actually teaching at least partially in person. And then we finished teaching in person at Thanksgiving. And then we had a week of like fully online, and then we had finals period. So what I did was I had the 4th midterm exam right before Thanksgiving. They had one chance to retest in that week when we were online after Thanksgiving. And then their final, like I said, was just, you can retest, I think like 10 or 12 objectives, right? So that was their final opportunity. I did not do a cumulative final. And I think for doing things the first time, I would encourage people to keep it as simple for yourself and your students as possible. That was pretty successful for me.
Great. All right, we've got another one. This is from Christy Klosser, and Christy asks, how do you balance flexibility for students with faculty burnout or faculty becoming overwhelmed? Without semi-strict deadlines, due dates, and grace periods, I've been totally overwhelmed at the end of the semester. Got a bunch of students who seem that they need to complete everything in the final week. Do you have any tips for us about how to balance, being very flexible to students and not overwhelming the instructors?
Yeah. So I think if you were in a class where, so obviously, like if I have an exam, right, that's the time that the exam is happening, right? So some of these deadline issues, I didn't have that because of the exam structure. I think if you were doing like a project-based class, that might be more of a problem. And I have done, I think Kate briefly mentioned this in the intro, in the spring semester, I did this cancer bio class where I did ungrading. And so I did have these flexible deadlines there. But what I didn't have a huge problem with people not turning things in on time. So I'm trying to think about good tips. I think that a couple things. So when I did the standards based in intro bio, I did have that kind of, you can only retest 2 every week. I think it's really important to have some type of limit there, like, because otherwise you definitely are just going to burn out. I also included, so I have this spreadsheet, which I can share. I can look up and try to share a link when I'm not talking because I can't do 2 things at once. But I had this spreadsheet which tracked essentially for them like which standards you've met. And later in the semester, I added this thing that said like how many like retest chances do you have left, right? So they could see like, oh, I still have 13 standards to meet and I have 15 retest opportunities. Like I need to get on this. And I think that might be something I'll incorporate in that kind of calculate your grade question is like, do you, what type of pace do you need to have to keep up with that? I also, so the friend that I'm mentioning who has these Best Buy dates, so this is Heather Mycelli, who also works at Roger Williams. She teaches bio or like science for non-majors. And she does something where she kind of splits the semester, I think, into like thirds. And it's like anything that's due in the first third has a Best Buy date, but it really has to be handed in by like, hard deadline of whatever your first third of the semester is. So then at least you don't leave everything to the very, very end. I think that would be effective. But again, I'm sure people are putting other thoughts in the chat, hopefully, for classes that are more kind of project-based.
Yeah, that's great. Katie, if you don't mind clicking to the next slide for me,
Yeah.
We'll have to finish up this session for now, just to give everyone a quick overview of where we're going from here. Now that it's the top of the hour, we'll have a lunch break for the next 1 hour of time. Following that, we've got 3 different things that are running concurrently. We've got a poster session, and then we have 2 different discussion group links based on what time zone you're working in. So the idea is that this will help you meet other participants at the conference who are somewhat local to you, at least, north-south local, if not from somewhere closer to you than that. So we'll stop it here for the next hour of time, and we'll see you back after lunch, after our break time, and we're looking forward to it. If you don't already follow Katie on Twitter, I completely suggest that you do that. I'm putting her Twitter link into the chat, and then I'll try and gather up all of these links and post them to the inclusive channel on our Slack group. And thanks for coming, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you, Katie. This is fantastic. All right, there we are. I think Sharona will probably cut off our recording here and we'll go and have some